So Sony just announced the A1, its new flagship mirrorless camera, and it was a pretty spec heavy presentation yesterday. So today I wanted to go through all of the specs and unpick some of those because they didn't mention quite a few things, and I'm going to be letting you guys know all the details, what this camera can actually do and what it can't do, more importantly, coming right up. So I know some of you will be hybrid shooters and others will just be photographers or videographers. So I've split this video up and I'm going to put timestamps down below on the video. And this first section is going to be all about the photography specs and what they mean for you. And then the second half of the video is going to be all about the video specs. And then I'll just talk about a few extra bits and bobs at the end. So check out the timestamps down below if you don't want to watch the whole thing. But yeah, there's quite a lot to go through, so I'm going to crack on. So I've got my notes on my phone here because I literally went on Sony's website and went through all of the features and specifications in detail. And yeah, so the first thing to say is it's a 50 megapixel stacked back illuminated sensor, and that's the first time they've done that. It's 21 megapixel in crop mode, so if you're going into the crop mode on the camera, you're still getting 21 megapixels, which is pretty astounding. And it's the first time that Sony has brought lossless compressed raw files, which basically means you're getting a smaller raw file but without any lossy compression. So previously, if you wanted a compressed raw file, a smaller file, it was losing quality. Now, it is able to shoot at 30 frames a second with the electronic shutter, but there are a couple of caveats to that. So if you want to shoot 30 frames a second, it's going to need to be in the 12-bit RAW file, so you're dropping quality. If you want to shoot the maximum RAW file size, the 14-bit RAW files, you're going to need to shoot at 20 frames a second maximum. So that's the uncompressed or the lossless RAW files. Interestingly, the mechanical shutter can only shoot 10 frames a second compared to, for example, the Canon R5 that does 12 frames a second mechanical. So that could be an issue for some people. We'll get on to talking about how good the electronic shutter is later in the video, because they've made some pretty big improvements by the looks of things. In terms of buffer size, again, quite similar to the Canon R5, which I have owned now for a few months, and I've tested the buffer out in some detail. And yeah, they're saying about 165 full res JPEG files and 155 compressed RAW, which probably means that uncompressed RAW probably about 80, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. I know on the Canon R5 I think I can get about 60. So when we're talking about 30 frames a second, it's also blackout free, so there's no blackout in the viewfinder when you're at that speed. And again, that's something that is pretty damn impressive, to be honest. And they've also got an anti-flicker shoot mode in the electronic shutter, which is meant to improve for things like banding. So previously, when you're shooting electronic shutter with a lot of Sony cameras, just mirrorless cameras generally, you get that kind of banding effect in images. And they showed a couple of examples here where that just seems to disappear. Part of that is that you can set the electronic shutter to be in like decimal increments. So if you're at 1/8000th of a second, and you're finding you're getting some banding, you can actually just tweak it slightly so that it's going outside the frequency of the flicker of any lights. So that's pretty impressive. And the same applies for rolling shutter and distortion. They showed some people hitting golf drives. I'll put those up on screen so you can see it. The other thing to talk about is the flash sync speed. It's pretty impressive. So this is the first camera that you can actually shoot flash with the electronic shutter, and the flash sync is up to 1/200th of a second with the electronic shutter, but up to 1/400th of a second mechanical, and actually in APS-C crop mode it will go up to 1/500th of a second. So again, these are all really impressive stats from Sony, really impressive specifications. It will be great to see what it's like to use, and I am hoping to get one to test in the next couple of months. It's out in March over here in the UK, and I think everywhere else actually. And yeah, I'll be trying to get one to test as soon as I can after that date. The shutter itself is a new design, so That's what allows that extra speed with the flash sync. It's got like a dual actuator in it. The mechanical shutter, it's 30 seconds up to 1/8,000th of a second, which is basically what the R5 does and what the previous A9 II did, I think. But the electronic shutter now goes up to 1/32,000th of a second, which is phenomenal. The R5 only goes up to 1/8,000th. I'm making comparisons to the R5 because a lot of people are going to do that, even though it's a fair bit cheaper. The price of the R5 currently is, I think, about $3,800, maybe a little bit less now. But this camera, the A1, is $6,500 at launch, and it's the same in pounds. So it's a big jump up in price, but there are certain things that you're getting for that. In terms of stills, moving on, the ISO range 100 to 32,000, and that's expandable up to 50 to 102,400. Interestingly, that is a bit less than the A9 II. That that goes up to 51,900 before you expand it. So interested to see what difference that makes and how it affects things for low light shooting. They've implemented the pixel shift that we've seen in the A7R series cameras. You can shoot between 4 and 16 shots in pixel shift mode, which will give you a single still image of up to about 199 megapixel, which is pretty impressive. It will be interesting again to see how usable that mode is, because I know in previous cameras it's been okay, but you really have to have a very still platform, and even on a tripod it doesn't always work very well. I have tried it on the A7R III before. The AF performance looks absolutely phenomenal. It looks like it's even better than their previous cameras. They're saying that the AF does 120 calculations per second, and I think that's about 2.5 to 3 times more than the previous A9s. And it also has eye tracking for both human, animal, and for the first time bird eye tracking in stills modes. You don't get that bird and animal in movies, I don't think, in video modes. The viewfinder, as I said, is blackout free, and it will refresh it up to a rate of 240 frames per second, which again is the highest from any Sony camera. It's got the same 9 million dot EVF as the A7S III, which I'm filming this on right now. And that is just the best viewfinder I've ever used on a camera. It's beautiful. A bit of a letdown is the rear touchscreen. It is not a flip out. It's one of the vari angle ones like the old style. That's not really the letdown. The letdown is the fact it's still only 1.44 million dots, and yeah, just the quality, it's not up to the standard and size of something like the R5. Has quite a bit bigger screen and better quality. And it does have touch tracking, which is good for the AF, and it also has the touch menu system that is found on the A7S III, so that's great. I've found that menu system to be really good over the last couple of months of use, and yeah, far easier than the previous menu systems. It appears to have this pretty much same body design as the A9 II, and kind of a bit of a mix between that and the A7S III, but it's got that extra dial up on the left-hand side when you're behind the camera, which allows for adjustment of the drive modes and the AF modes just on the fly, so that's good. In terms of the video specs now, this is the first Sony mirrorless camera to shoot 8K, and it's giving you an 8.6K oversampled down to 8K, and that is at 10-bit 420, so we're not getting 422, but it is 10-bit, which is really important, and it's internal, so there's no RAW or all-I. That does mean one good thing is it can be recorded to the SD cards. Now this has got the same dual card slot as the A7S III, which has 2 slots which both take SD cards and also the new CF Express Type A cards, which Sony do. And what I like about that is you've got redundancy both in stills and video modes. So you can shoot to both cards and it will record to both. And by the sounds of it, you'll be able to record 8K to both, which is pretty astounding. I presume that would need to be an SD card of a like high enough speed, so like the V90 cards. I doubt anything below that would do the job for that. But yeah, because the codec they're using is the XAVC HS H.265 codec, so it's going to be pretty hard on the computers for the 8K, but you can also shoot proxies in the camera, so that will help with editing, and it'll be interesting to see how it is for editing. But yeah, it's pretty amazing that you can actually put it onto SD cards. The 4K coming from this camera is going to be slightly different to, for example, the A7S III. They're giving us the 4K 120 that we saw on the A7S III, but the 4K is going to be in full frame mode, is going to be pixel binned by the looks of it. They said in the presentation that the 4K Super 35 mode, so the crop sensor mode, is 5.8K downsampled to 4K. So that's great, that's going to be a beautiful image, but the full frame 4K is going to be pixel binned, I assume. We'll have to wait and see exactly how that works, but I think it will still be a nice image, but it may not be of the same quality that you get from the 4K on the A7S III, or certainly not the R5, for example, which downsamples from 8K for the 4K HQ high quality mode, which does give a beautiful image and actually is slightly, I'd say slightly better than the A7S III's image. Huge range of codecs. Basically, it seems to have all the same codecs that you get on the A7S III, which is great. And interestingly, the 4K 120 seems to be the same that you get from the A7S III, and it also has the HD 240 frames a second by the looks of things in the S&Q mode. The 4K full frame is also more than DCI in terms of the kind of image size. So it allows for the 16-bit RAW output that we saw on the A7S III through the HDMI port to a compatible recorder, which is really good. And you can do that whilst recording internally as well. So that's really good as well. The other thing that I was surprised by, which was a really pleasant surprise, but a little bit annoying as someone who owns an A7S III, is that they are putting S-Cinetone in this A1. We've seen that colour profile on the FX6 and the FX9 cinema line, and this camera, the A1, is getting it. Hopefully they're going to put it in the A7S III via firmware at some point, but that remains to be seen. It also has the independent menu settings for stills and for movies or video. So again, that's great because you can set up your camera completely for still images on one side and then movie, video stuff on the other, and you don't have to fiddle around in the menus all the time, which is fantastic. We've still got the same image stabilisation that we've seen on recent Sony cameras like the Sony A7S III. So you've got the extra active stabilisation, which crops in 10%, and that's up to 4K 60. You don't get that at 4K 120 or 8K, but you do get the 5-axis normal Sony stabilisation, which is good. Also on this camera is the digital audio interface from Sony that we've seen on the ZV-1 and the A7S III, and that allows for wireless microphones from Sony to be attached. The other thing that they made quite a big deal about, obviously because this is for pros and professional sports photographers and news photographers in particular, was the network connections on this camera. They've put on a not only really fast Wi-Fi, but they've put a gigabit Ethernet port on like the A9, and we've also got a really high speed 10 gigabit USB-C port for fast charging on the go. They've also made quite a big thing about the potential to use the newly released XPERIA phone with this camera, and obviously that's a 5G enabled phone to leverage 5G data transfers. I presume you'll be able to do that with other 5G capable phones as well. And they're also talking about using the XPERIA's HDMI port to allow you to use the phone as a monitor and also for live streaming. So you could be out on location live streaming using the phone's data connection and through the camera. So yeah, some really interesting kind of innovations there that we'll start to see hopefully more and more on these cameras. It is a bit disappointing that they haven't just put in a cellular 5G connection or even a 4G connection in the camera, but it seems like camera manufacturers just don't want to do that at the moment. And all of this speed and responsiveness from the camera is coming from dual Bions XR processors, which are new processors that they're using in the camera to give all of that processing power to get through the 30 frames a second at 50 megapixels. It's using the same Z batteries that we've seen in the recent Sony A7 series cameras, so the A7S III, for example. It's those same batteries, so battery life will be good, but not phenomenal. I think we'll have to wait and see to test exactly how many shots you're going to get out of it or how much video. And yeah, finally, one point that I noticed in Tony Northrop's video was that he said on a call with Sony that they confirmed the shutter closes or can close on switch off, power down of the camera. I presume that's an option you can turn on and off like it is on the Canon R5, and I think it was on the Sony A9 too previously. So that's great to see, because that is one thing I hate about the Sony cameras. You get dust on the sensor all the time. So an absolutely phenomenal piece of kit this camera looks like, and I will be testing it, as I said, in March, and I'll try and do a couple of videos for you. So yeah, really excited to try it out. Please do let me know down in the comments below if you're considering buying this camera or if it's actually just way out of your price range. I'm really interested to know who is thinking about purchasing this. Obviously it's a pro camera for kind of particular niche of people, but yeah, it's something that I'm considering selling my other cameras for, but it's just a little bit too much money at the moment. I think I'm going to wait till the price comes down to actually buy it. So yeah, hope you found this video helpful and the information in it has been useful, and you found out a bit more about the camera that you might not have known already. And yeah, if you do want to check it out, I've dropped some links down in the description below. They are affiliates, so I get a small commission, which really helps me out if you want to buy through those links. And I'll put links to all the other cameras and gear that I talked about in this video as well. If you haven't already, please do consider subscribing, give this video a like if you found it helpful, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.